In the last video, you learned that we can add CSS to an HTML document by using inline styles, internal style sheets, and external style sheets. While the recommended best practice approach is to use external style sheets, it's still good to know how to use all three ways. Go ahead and open your course folder with VS Code. From your course folder, let's open an HTML file that we've worked with before. Let's practice adding CSS to surveyform.html. We'll start with inline styles. Go down to the very last input element, the one that creates the submit button. If you recall, the submit button for this form was just a plain generic button. Let's add a style attribute, and we're going to add a declaration in the attribute value inside the quotes. Let's make this a green button by saying background, space, green, semicolon. Let's see what that looks like in the browser using Live Server. Now you can see that the button is green, but the text is a little hard to read now. Let's change that. To add another declaration to the same element style, we can add a space after the final semicolon, then the next declaration. Let's make the text color white so that it will stand out better. And we can do that with color, space, white, and semicolon. That looks better. So that's how you set CSS with an inline style. Let's look at using an internal style sheet next. To practice using an internal style sheet, we're going to take the inline style that we just set and turn it into a CSS rule set. Since there's only going to be one submit button for this form, and assuming that we won't be using this same set of styles for anything else, this could be a good candidate for an ID selector. Let's add the ID of submit-btn to this input element. Then let's cut the entire style attribute, and make sure to cut here, not delete. Then we'll go back up to the top to the head element, and to create an internal style sheet, we'll add a style element. Inside it, we'll set up the ID selector like this, the hash character, followed by the ID name, submit-btn, followed by a space and a set of curly braces to hold the declaration block. Remember, in the CSS rule set, we use the hash character to reference an ID name. That's how the browser knows that we want to select for an ID instead of a class or an element, so it will go looking for an element with an ID attribute that matches this name. Now we can paste the style attribute that we cut out into the declaration block. Let's delete everything except for the declarations, then put each declaration on its own line. If we've done this correctly, then the web page should look the same as before. We haven't changed the styles, we've only moved them from the inline style to the internal style sheet. Let's add a couple more CSS rule sets here. First, I would like to center the text in the H1 element. Let's use an element selector this time. We'll just say H1, then curly braces for the declaration block. And the way to center text is by using the text align property like this. Text-align, space, center, semicolon. Then let's use a class selector as well for practice using classes. To add a class selector, make sure you start with a full stop or period character. We'll name this class survey-form. We'll set the width property to 80% and the margin property to auto. That will make the form element take up 80% of its parent container, which in this case is the body element. Then the margin property set to auto will center it. We'll go more in depth about margins and widths in a later lesson. Now we need to go to the form element and add the class there. We'll add a class attribute and set its value to survey-form. At this point, your web page should look like this. Notice that both the heading and the form are centered, and the form is taking up 80% of the current window size. If I change the browser window size, then the size of the form changes with it to stay at 80%. For the last part of this exercise, we will move these styles to an external style sheet. To do this, I want you to create a new folder in your course folder and name it CSS. While this is not a technical requirement, it is typical for projects to have a separate folder for CSS files. With the CSS folder selected, hit the New File icon to create a new file inside that folder. Let's name this file survey.css. Then from the surveyform.html page, let's grab the entire style element and its contents and cut it out. Then we'll paste it into survey.css. Now delete these style tags so that all that's left are the CSS rule sets. This is now an external style sheet. However, if we look at the web page in the browser now, all of the styles will be gone. We've created the external style sheet, but we haven't yet linked it to this web page. So back in the surveyform.html file inside the head, where we deleted the style element, we will now need to add a link element, which is a void element, so it has just one tag. Give it a rel attribute of style sheet. Then for the href attribute, a relative path to the CSS file. Now when you look at the survey form in the browser, these styles should have reappeared. And if you were to create another web page where you wanted to use the exact same styles, all you would have to do is link the same CSS file to it. This brings us to the end of this exercise. I hope your understanding of CSS has improved with this practice. Go on to the next lesson to learn even more.